Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Socially Distant Lawyer. I'm Mitch Ayes.
And I'm Greg Vinogradsky.
Greg, it's been a little bit of time since we got together, right?
It has been. It has been a few weeks for sure.
Happy Thanksgiving. It's our Thanksgiving episode.
That's right.
I got those Thanksgiving colors on, the fall, autumn colors. Looks like you do too.
I'm decked out, ready to go, ready for some turkey eating. I have 2 Thanksgiving dinners to go to.
That's a lot.
It'll be a busy day, and Friday I'll be doing a lot of sleeping. How about yourself?
Not working?
Not working Friday.
We are hosting our first Thanksgiving.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's bold.
No, we're not doing the turkey though. We decided to open up the house and do a couple things, but my sister's in charge of the turkey, so I think we'll be okay.
So there'll be turkey there.
There'll be turkey there for sure. There'll be turkey. There'll be a lot of odds and ends. Ariana's busy cooking some stuff up. She'll let me know what it is on Wednesday, Thursday.
All right.
So it'll be fun.
It will be fun. What better way to bring it in than talk about fraud today, right?
It's good. We talked about fraud a little bit in I think on our last podcast that we did. We did a little fraud episode, or a couple podcasts ago on fraud. When we started to see a lot of New York issues.
Yeah, it kind of blew up. Like every single aspect of those cases have been examined by the judges now, so we have a lot more kind of a roadmap of where to go with these kinds of claims. We've had a couple in our office that we're looking at, right, that we're trying to take action on. But there's definitely been a turn, I would say, in New York, and really, I think nationally, as there's been those kind of viral clips. I don't know, I'm sure you saw the one of the car accident where the person backed into the lady, and then they all got out holding their necks, and and then when they realized there was a dash cam, they all sped away.
Yeah, a client was happy to show that to me. We were in a mediation, and she's like, "Have you seen this clip?" And I said, "No, what are you talking about?" She's like, "Oh, let me send it to you." It was eye-opening, I guess.
Yeah, and it goes to show, like, I almost immediately wanted to buy a dash cam, right, to like protect myself, protect my wife from that kind of crazy stuff.
For sure.
Because it happens, and then what usually has happened is it's like he said, she said, right? Who are you going to believe? The person with the car that got rear-ended that's claiming they have a neck injury, or the one claiming that they backed up into the person, right? It's very tricky.
It is. It's been New York has definitely been a hotbed of it lately, but other states have definitely seen it throughout the years. It seems like it's been being centered now in New York, and our firm's done, I think, a good job of trying to exploit some of it.
So what's interesting is kind of New York is like ripe for it, and we're gonna like talk about it, how like labor law 240 cases and labor law cases in general in New York, the way that the statute is written. When you see a claim, you almost immediately think, how do I get out of this thing? Because the law is written so strictly, right? It's almost strict liability. It's pretty tricky. And that's
defendants, strict liability against defendants.
Strict liability against defendants. So if there's a workplace accident, right, and then you're really almost on the hook completely, and at that point, you just try to look for how to transfer risk, right? Because you can't really levy comparative negligence against the plaintiff. So there's all kinds of issues that you come across when you have those kinds of claims, and that's really specific to New York, right? And that's where you see a lot of these potential fraud claims, and why it's kind of blowing up in these areas where the law is really, really plaintiff friendly. We've talked about the Wrongful Death Act and things like that, right? How there's so much plaintiff friendly laws that are drafted. So what does it do? Well, everybody starts to enter that marketplace, right? And it's just the volume of it is way too much for the courts to handle, to try to flush all these out.
Yeah, I agree. And you start seeing investors coming into this litigation. That's what happens with the litigation funding piece. And people are trying to get into this space, especially on these type of cases, which just it breeds some of this. I think it's just a matter of, it's just the type of litigation, the way that the statute's written, it opens itself up to these claims, because the frivolous accidents, the accidents that are set up, right? It's just so easy if there's no one on video that catches you, or to move forward with those because of the onerous burden on the defendant.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just, right, the labor law construction cases, right? You have the trucking cases, obviously. Our office handles a lot of, where there's all kind of it's always been kind of sketchy, right? Who entered whose lane, things like that. And it's not just the statutes, but really the way you plead in New York, right? It's just general pleading. So you never really have to get into the specifics of a case for like a year or 2 years potentially. At that point, somebody had a fusion, right? And so you think this case is really bad. It's only going to get worse if you let it hang out. And you may never even get to the fact-finding part of the case, where you really get into the accident dynamics and really start to examine what happened with the plaintiff, because all you're faced with is a gigantic potential injury, right? And you got to kind of work your way from there.
Yep, the numbers just keep getting bigger. So,
right.
But yeah, I think we are fortunate in our firm that we have a kind of a fraud unit that's developed, an investigation group. We're going to bring on our partner, Chris Bove, today to talk a little bit about that, his background, and he'll give it to everyone. It was he'd done this investigation before coming here, did a lot of fraud work, and he's now spearheading our kind of fraud unit that we have at CNF, and our first fraud report that's going to be coming out, highlighting what's been going on in the state of New York and then nationally as well.
Yeah, I think it's important for a firm like ours to kind of get out there, because we're at the lower level, right? So we see all of these claims come in, we do all the investigations. So it's going to be important, I think, for us to kind of let the carriers and let kind of the world know, like, this is what we're seeing and this is kind of things to look out for, and these are the steps that we're taking to try to prevent these, right? I know we had a successful motion for an affirmative defense for fraud that was recently came down, right? That was helpful. So now we have that we can try to fight back on. Yeah. There's a lot of things we can do. Obviously, things were limited because we don't represent the carriers. So the carriers at some point are going to have to step in. And that's where you're seeing a lot of these lawsuits that we talked about at the last time. These RICO cases are coming in, right? From the insurance companies are deciding to bring their own claim, because when we come in, we represent the insured, right? So we can certainly do affirmative defenses and maybe counterclaims and things like that for fraud, but we can't bring in these large scale, usually can't bring in these large scale causes of action, but we can use those to mitigate the cases that we have, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it all starts, a lot of the comp stuff that we talked about last time is where this all started, all this trying to hone in on why these fees keep getting paid out over and over again, especially during COVID. I think that's when the carrier kind of zeroed in on what's going on in the market.
Yeah, and it's funny, I was talking randomly on a case that I had, and there was a comp lien, and we're talking to one of the comp attorneys that handled it, and basically they're like, they always pay these out. They don't do a lot of investigation in the comp world on these types of claims, and they don't always see all of the medical records. They're not always privy to as much information when they make a determination as to permanency or things like that. That maybe we would, way down the road, we would get more of a full scope of exactly what happened and whether that treatment was necessary or whether it was even caused, right? Because the frustrating thing when we get a case, you'll see, well, they pool in a bunch of injuries and call it the comp claim, right? And that's the comp lien. But when you start to look at it, you're like, wait a minute, this injury was not caused by this accident, right? This was caused by something separate, but it still fell into the comp lien world, so that we have to still deal with it. So there's a lot trickier when you're dealing with the comp lien, which is where these fraud cases start to come up in comp.
Yeah, I agree. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get our expert involved. And Chris Bove, welcome to the program, and we can't wait to hear what you got to tell us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. And I guess I just wanted to kind of start by saying that the firm, Callahan Fusco, is pleased to announce that we have started a fraud unit at our firm involved, and right now it's about 4 or 5 partners that are teaming up, and it's our goal to make sure that everyone has the information that they need to discuss fraud and give everyone the tools to fight fraud.
Yeah. And we're coming out with, we should also mention that you're coming to us live from our office in Fort Lauderdale, right? How's that?
Yes, it's beautiful down here in Florida, and make no mistake about it. Typically, states that have very high or no fault limits have a lot of fraud. So there's certainly a ton of fraud going on down here in Florida as well.
Right in Fort Lauderdale, right? The epicenter is probably around there.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the fraud report that's starting to come out from us?
Sure. So the firm is going to be pushing out a couple updates a month that it's going to be just sort of in bullet point, very easily digestible information, sharing both with our clients and other law firms what's going on in the world of fraud. The whole point and the whole basis of it is to share information. Because we know that the plaintiff's bar, sharing information, whether it be deposition transcripts of, various doctors or individuals, and the defense bar needs to catch up. So part of our goal and our objective is just to make sure that both other defense firms, carriers, self-insureds all have the information they need to level the playing field.
So I think one of the real interesting parts of what you do is you handle a lot of these labor law cases that we talked about a little bit before in New York. You're the labor law guy, as I call it, right, in our firm. You do a lot of other things, right? You're not just that, but specifically with labor law, why don't you get into it? Because for people that might not know New York practice, they probably have no idea what it is and why it's so vulnerable to these types of fraud claims.
Sure. So for running the risk of oversimplifying, for those that don't know, labor law in the state of New York is any accident that occurs, any gravity-related injury that occurs at a construction site. It obviously gets more complicated from there, but that's essentially what we're talking about. The problem has become that a lot of what we're seeing, these cases were unwitnessed accidents. So, for example, somebody falling off a ladder and magically being found on the ground, or some object falling from somewhere and injuring somebody. So labor law cases tend, at least, prior to this whole, epidemic, lend themselves to this type of behavior because someone could easily just say that they fell off a ladder and it was an unwitnessed accident. And at least in New York, from a defense perspective, it could potentially be difficult to push back against that allegation.
But why is New York labor law ripe for this? Why is it such an issue with New York labor law?
Essentially, New York labor law is that of strict liability. Any fall, as I kind of said before, any fall from a height or gravity-related injury can be a cause of action against an owner or a general contractor. So there's really not, unlike a lot of cases that lend themselves to negligence and issues of fact, it borders closer to what we would call strict liability than a negligence action.
Yeah, and also I think can you assess comparative negligence on plaintiff in these types of cases?
For certain causes of action, no. Under 241, no, the answer is no. Under different causes of action, so for example, typically labor law, it's divided into three separate areas. It's 241, 241-6, and 200. All of those refer to specific statutory references within the state of New York. And for 241, the answer essentially is no, which is, again, another thing that makes these cases, so susceptible to fraud.
So you have basically strict liability, right? You really can't assess comparative fault on plaintiff. And then what I found, at least in the cases that I've handled, right, is the amount of defendants and parties that are in play based on the statute, right? Why don't you get into a little bit about who's responsible? Because it seems like it's everybody, and it just comes down to risk transfer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way the statutes are written is the owner, as I said, the owner and the general contractor are the ones that are statutorily liable. Now, everybody seeks to sort of, pass the buck, if you will, or transfer the risk on down the line. So typically what happens is the owner contracts with the general contractor, who then may contract with a sub or two or three until it gets all the way down, essentially, to plaintiff's employer. Of course, under the workers' comp bar, typically plaintiff's employer is going to be immune, except under two conditions. The first is which there's what you call a grave injury, which is statutorily defined, but suffice it to say, plaintiff is severely, gravely injured. And the second way an employer could be held responsible is contractually, so that they undertook an obligation to defend or indemnify, either a series of companies or one specific general contractor. So a lot of times what these cases turn on is who contracted with who, and when, and what those contracts say. We see contracts ranging from 1,000-page AIA contracts, which are very professional and outline, every single possible scenario. And then we see contracts that are essentially one-page, handwritten, handshake deal type of thing. And all of those issues need to be litigated in terms of, what the parties meant to contract for.
So we've identified the problem, right? We've identified that fraud is an issue in these cases. So what are we doing now to help solve that problem internally? What are the steps that we're taking as a firm?
Sure. So again, I think it goes back to one of the reasons why we're starting this regional fraud report is, a lot of fraud is patterns. Thankfully, fraudsters aren't necessarily, smart in terms of it. A lot of times we see the same series and patterns of fraud over and over and over again. So by sharing information, both with other, clients and non-clients alike, as well as other defense counsel, we're helping to put together these patterns. So I'll give you, for example, one of the things that we're working on is really studying and aggregating the addresses of some plaintiffs and potential plaintiffs. So, for example, one issue that we're seeing right now is there were a couple of various addresses within Queens and the Bronx that several, about 40 to 50 separate plaintiffs were all linked to the same address, and not only the same address, but the same apartment. And obviously, statistically, what are the chances of that? Probably nearly impossible. So it's things like that. It's all about identifying patterns and then sharing those patterns and then sort of putting all this information in the aggregate. When we really start to put it all together, that's when we start to, be able to kind of put together a persuasive explanation as to what's happened.
Yeah.
And what about in court? What have we taken specific actions through litigation so far that have helped us to achieve favorable results in this area?
So I think to answer your question, Mitch, one of the things that we're doing is asserting cross claims and counterclaims against plaintiffs. So if we haven't answered, we can go ahead and file an answer, or if we have, we can move to amend to include specific affirmative defenses that this plaintiff's allegations were a product of staged fraud. Another thing we're doing is we're issuing very specific demands, as well as we're finding that a lot of this fraud is tied to litigation funding and litigation loans. So we're requesting those specific loan agreements. If it's not being provided, we're subpoenaing it. And another big thing, at least that we're seeing in the Northeast, is obviously everyone's been talking about the tradesman RICO case and all of the various medical providers that have been implicated. So, of course, if we're seeing one of those medical providers, which I think we all know, generally who they are by now, we are issuing specific demands related to that, as well as if the circumstances arise, getting specific IMEs to try to help confirm if these surgeries happened, and if they did happen, were they necessary for the treatment.
And you just mentioned litigation funding. Why do you think that litigation funding is so pervasive in the labor law context, and how is that leading to the potential that it's wrapped up in the fraud issue?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, these lawsuits have become a commodity for a certain industry, and they are to some extent, an investment that both law firms and certain lawyers and physicians are making, in exchange multiple years down the road, hoping for a big payout. And in order to be able to get there, they need an investment of cash to essentially fund these litigations. And so, fortunately or unfortunately, it's become a business, and really the only way, to get a hold of this would probably be through some sort of additional regulations, which we are, starting to see in some states. The proper, disclosure is being required. I know recently in the last couple of years under the federal rules, specific disclosures need to be made, but unfortunately, not every state is, taking this as seriously as they should. I know in New York, we did a update a couple of months ago that there's some proposed amendments that would require some initial disclosures of this information, but unfortunately, there hasn't really been anything passed with teeth just quite yet.
Yeah. All right, Chris. Well, thanks a lot. There's a lot of information we got from you today. I know we focus a lot on labor law. I think we should keep this conversation going and talk about other areas as the cases continue. I know transportation is a big area where it happens. We've probably all seen the videos out there about staged accidents. That's another area that we can get into on a different day. We'll leave our fans with a cliffhanger about what we can get into. But the labor law, great job on this. Greg, any parting words for Chris?
No. Looking forward to the fraud report coming out.
Yep.
and helping out where I can in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone, check out the regional fraud report, and it was good chatting with you guys. See you soon.
Have a happy Thanksgiving, Chris. Thanks to Chris for coming on. I think that was insightful, especially with the release of our fraud report that's coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to more of this stuff coming out. I mean, as we get these cases, identifying treatment providers and these kinds of opportunities for fraud, and now when we go to the court, because all this has come out, we actually have something to support the arguments we've been making for years about litigation funding, right, and really trying to dive into these providers. Now the courts have to take it a little more seriously because there's tons and tons of case law and lawsuits being filed all over the place, and some of the stuff is egregious. It's obvious when you have 30 plaintiffs all living in the same apartment building, all having workplace accidents, right? Red flag, and now we can take that to the court and really support our arguments that we've been making for years.
It's all about just using the data to our advantage, which is what we try to do the best these days, is try to use that data, triangulate, so to speak, what's going on, the locations, seeing if there's any video. Does that raise a red flag? The addresses raise a red flag. The medical providers raise red flags. Put it all together, it's big issues.
I just thought about maybe something interesting is like the use of AI in identifying these issues, and I wonder if that's going to be something that we use later on. Is when you collect all this data, right? Right now we can put all the data we collect for all the cases, and maybe we'll have artificial intelligence be able to do a deep dive into it and say what are cases that are likely fraud, and maybe they're able to compile this and give us some real information. Maybe that's where the industry's headed.
Yeah, could use AI to our advantage, hopefully.
Yeah, who knows?
So. Good episode. Good chatting with you, Greg.
Yeah, as always.
As always, exactly. Remember, follow us on all of our social media channels. Stay tuned for the fraud report. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Take care.